Welcome to Stand Up, Fight Back, your author interview podcast. I'm your host, Chris. Today on the show, we welcome James Tracy, author of Dispatches Against Displacement. You can find a link to that book at fightbackpodcast.com or at AK Press, the publisher. James is a longtime housing rights activist out of San Francisco, and he stops by for about an hour today to talk about his work with various coalitions and anti-eviction direct action groups and residents fighting evictions and displacement in San Francisco over the last 20 years, and his work with the Community Land Trust. It's really interesting, really engaging, and I hope you enjoy it. James, your connection to this displacement struggle began in the 1990s, at least in the narrative of your book. Can you tell us more about how you became involved in these struggles and also what San Francisco looked like in the 1990s?
Yeah, so I moved into San Francisco about 1990, 1991. I had a job as a truck driver at a thrift store. So we would pick up donations for the store, and my partner and I noticed that we were getting a lot of donations from landlords who were donating the belongings of people that they had recently evicted. In San Francisco, of course, there's laws against that type of shenanigans, but landlords would even routinely ignore those. And we really got a sense that a gigantic housing crisis was coming. Both of us had been exposed and been part of different radical politics over in the 80s, growing up as teenagers. And we decided to start an organization called Eviction Defense Network, which was largely inspired by our study of the unemployed workers movements of the 1930s, where using kind of a block-by-block strategy, neighbors would defend neighbors physically through direct action against evictions. We certainly never got to that level of activity, but we were very effective. Eviction Defense Network did kind of rebuild a direct action face to the movement for housing rights in San Francisco. We didn't invent it. Many people in past decades had fought many valiant fights using direct action, but in the early 90s there was a little bit of ebb in that activity, so we helped resuscitate that fighting spirit. Because of our independence, we were a non-profit, all volunteer, very similar to what some of your listeners may think of as a solidarity network today. We were actually invited to work with residents that were organizing in public housing in the early 1990s. Those residents were taking on the Hope 6 program. The Hope 6 program was a federally funded, federally initiated program where public housing was torn down and rebuilt, and only various regulations, made it very unlikely for the majority of residents to return to their rebuilt homes. So, naturally, residents of North Beach Public Housing and Army Street Public Housing, and to a lesser extent, some of the other developments, really, organized very fiercely and very bravely at the time, and we were there to have their back to help out in their campaigns, work under their leadership.
You mentioned the Hope 6 program, which was a program of the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, demolished huge numbers of public housing structures across the country, with at least the putative goal of replacing some of the public housing units in those structures. But you wrote that a 2004 study found that only 21,000 units had been built to replace the almost 50,000 demolished units. So what impact did those demolitions and evictions have for public housing residents in San Francisco?
In San Francisco, to a large extent, people who exited public housing moved out to various working class suburbs far away from their from their communities that they had been part of for many years, moving out to places like Vallejo in Antioch and Hayward. One impact that's really interesting is that the housing authority actually hired people that were called self-sufficiency experts. These self-sufficiency experts identified people in public housing who were the most stable, who had a decent job. I mean, sometimes being the 90s, had two or three jobs, but were making ends meet. And they basically said, we can help you into home ownership. We'll connect you with a lender, and if you promise not to take federal subsidy again, we'll turn you into a homeowner. And many people took advantage of that of that deal, very understandably, moved out to places like Antioch, but were also funneled right into the jaws of subprime lending, like countrywide lending and many others. So 8 years later, they were also kind of at the forefront of the foreclosure crisis, at least here in the Bay Area. So many people were displaced twice, in the after effects of this program.
And many of the residents who remained in public housing or faced eviction letters from public housing or just from normal landlords in San Francisco were really at the forefront of this organizing and directing it. Can you tell us more about the work they were doing?
Yeah, at North Beach Public Housing, where I did most of my solidarity work, or our solidarity work, happened in a place in San Francisco, some of the most desirable property in the city, right near Fisherman's Wharf, right where the fabled cable car has a turnaround, is right in the middle of public housing. So the residents there didn't need people to organize them per se, but they, a lot of them were former Black Panthers or had experience in the civil rights movement, or even had a summertime job working for Acorn at the time. Just doing basic community organizing. So the level of skills there, were actually quite considerable. So what they needed from us are people to help build coalitions with the larger community outside of public housing. They needed people to help pass out flyers. Many of them were elderly and couldn't make it up to the top of the development because the elevator, of course, was busted in a disinvestment place. So we basically did whatever it took. So there were certainly the leaders at North Beach, people like my hero B. Harper and Alma Lark, people like that, certainly were great at mobilizing their community to get down to City Hall, to speak out, and to help put this issue kind of at the forefront of the housing crisis dialogue that was going on at the time. At a time where really the needs of public housing residents were really being seen as something separate from the rest, from the rest of the renters movement, and they were very responsible for turning that dialogue around, both within the left and also certainly, certainly in mass media and the mainstream media. And there's a very creative dialogue between public housing activists and the outside supporters such as ourselves. Our organization felt that certainly going down to City Hall had reached the limits. We'd push that tactic as far as possible, and we needed to take direct action. And I remember at a meeting, a lot of the residents agreed with us, but also, quite correctly pointed out that they, also were under the gun of various authorities. At the time there was one strike your outlaws that could make it very easy to get kicked out of public housing. Many people had child protective services or immigration and naturalization, literally breathing down their neck, and so. Doing things like shutting down that cable car, like we were suggesting, wasn't something that they were particularly interested in. But because of the long-term relationship that we had built up in the trust, we were actually able to come up with creative ideas on how to fight back. Together, we did research, literally going through, volumes of federal regulations around a table, in B's house, and we found out that the residents had been lied to, that federal regulations saying that there must be mixed income, they were being told that mixed income in the new developments meant reducing the amount of low-income units when actually they just needed to be mixed. So so people were able to mount a counterattack and demand all low-income units uh, be replaced one for one, and that the additional mixed income, slightly higher affordable housing would be in addition to that, and they won that. And they won that because they decided to vote with their butts, and they refused to move until a collective bargaining agreement was signed by the housing authority. That was kind of a 10-point program around right to return and replacement of units and other tenant protections. And their leverage mainly was that money had to go back to HUD if they weren't relocated by a certain amount of time. So, together we were able to to kind of identify points of leverage, and fight back against a $130 million project and make some gains.
It sounds like the San Francisco Housing Authority not telling the truth is or was a recurring theme of your organizing work. So you tell a story about how um, housing authority staff tried to play public housing residents off each other, using like racial tensions and tensions around um, new residents and immigrants. And you tell a
Oh,
story about how a staff was spreading falsehoods in Cantonese to a Chinese tenant, and it was only because an African American tenant in the building understood Cantonese that residents were able to counter some of these untruths.
absolutely, and one of the most effective organizing tactics we ever did certainly wasn't the protest, but actually just bringing in competent translators so people could have face-to-face conversations with each other. And talk things out and vet out rumors that had sprung up, and certainly for every lie that the housing authority spread, there was another just baseless rumor that just happened because people were under the gun and very rightfully a little paranoid about the future was going on. So making the space where people could actually speak to one another was probably one of the most effective radical things we could have contributed to that struggle, which we were able to do.
So you also talk a lot about the tactics that residents and allies use to combat these evictions, and especially um, back in the late 90s with in these public housing units that were being shut down because of Hope 6. And you say that the organizing tactics used and developed in these public housing units were kind of echoed 9 years later at the start of Occupy. Can you talk a little bit more about what tactics people used and how successful they were?
One of the tactics that we used stemmed from the fact that we were able to see the connectedness of issues, that we didn't siphon off police brutality and police harassment as a separate tactic, because under federal regulations at the time, through the one strike you're out law, the it was extremely easy for any type of negative contact with the police or a security guard to result in evictions. So at the time, that was when the tactic of cop watching was starting to become widely used. In the years following the Rodney King verdict. So we got our hands on some video cameras and help residents develop a cop and security guard watch. They even made stickers that cribbed the old Clash song that said "Police and thieves, watch out. This is a working class neighborhood," and they put them all over the place. And there were probably only like 2 or 3 video cameras, and maybe one of which worked reliably, but it just it put the police on notice. It put the security guards, that were actually a bigger problem than the police at the time, on notice that they were being watched, and the negative interactions went way down over the course of months, and that resulted in many evictions going way down over the course of the same months.
Can you talk about the mission agenda and their direct action casework, as you called it?
Yeah, Mission Agenda was a fantastic organization. that was largely based in organizing residential hotel residents. Residential hotels, for listeners who aren't familiar with the term, are also known as single room occupancy hotels, where there's shared bathroom, sometimes shared kitchens, and very small dwellings. Um, in most cities that they existed, they were kind of the workers housing of the from the 20s to the 40s, for transient workers. But in the 80s and 90s became more and more kind of the housing of last resort for people who had lost access to most other forms of housing. So in the 90s, there was a gigantic fire epidemic that took down many residential hotels in San Francisco and displaced many people. Now, in the night previous to that, in the 80s, we were all very well aware of landlord arsons that were creating the same type of crisis that had happened right before the mission agenda came into being. So many of us actually thought that there was a conspiracy for landlord arson, but the truth was, it was all that was much more mundane, but even more scary. That the reason why residential hotels were burning down was because of just long-term neglect. That completely preventable fires and the lack of interest in enforcement from the city to make sure that buildings were kept up in a safe and decent way, and the lack of landlords' interest in improving their properties because poor people were living there were contributing to the fires, not direct arson or anything like that. The mission agenda basically would help displaced residents find a replacement housing, and through normal kind of casework tactics, and they would keep track of people where they went and did they find permanent housing elsewhere. There was the city would issue vouchers, for 2 to 3 weeks, and anytime the vouchers would expire, we would take everybody right over to City Hall and do sit-ins, and we would celebrate the personal victories of people who had secured housing, and then we would fight like hell for for those who hadn't found housing. And it was remarkably effective. It not only got the majority of people replacement housing, but it also provided some of the push, that many other great organizations contributed to towards, really stabilizing SROs, towards, making sure that the Department of Building Inspection actually held landlords accountable, and gaining the radical demand of functional fire sprinklers in residential hotels. We had found out that Vancouver had an ordinance like that was passed way back in the 80s, and they hadn't lost a building to fire since. And so, certainly the mission agenda, through a kind of direct action casework model, was able to make a lot of just very basic, human rights gains for residential hotel tenants in San Francisco.
So what happened to Mission Agenda, and um, did they ultimately succeed in protecting residents?
Well, yeah, I mean, certainly the mission agenda really reignited reignited kind of the anti-poverty fight in San Francisco in many ways. And I'm not saying that it invented it. Many other organizations, such as the Coalition on Homelessness and Tenderloin Housing Clinic, had done fantastic work and were doing it at the time. But there was something about the way that the mission agenda went about their business that really brought up the voices of people living in residential hotels in a very strong, very radical, and very forceful way, which of course then influenced the way that the rest of the movement saw poor people. So it certainly made a gigantic contribution, largely thanks to just very dogged, very non-conflict adverse organizing models, led by both residential hotel tenants and non-residential hotel tenants, like Richard Marquez, who's a lifelong San Franciscan, who was very steeped in Chicano politics, and a newcomer named Chris Daly, who later became a supervisor in San Francisco. And when Mission Agenda ultimately folded for many different reasons. It was a very intense group to work with in many ways, and never fully grappled with ways to kind of address internal trauma and community building within its very rigorous push for justice. So it did ultimately sunset, but I think that its contributions are still felt today.
So your book offers an analysis of trauma and trauma as an impediment to the ability of people to organize themselves and organize with their communities to change communities. So could you speak a little bit more about how you see trauma as one of those factors that hold these movements back?
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, trauma, the adverse personal consequences of oppression, you know, certainly, certainly influences the ways that we treat one another in movements and in organizations. And I think organizing has to actually be informed by the fact that many people in our movements lives are actually impacted by trauma. Now, I'm not advocating confusing self-care for organizing or organizing for self-care. I'm advocating self-care as one tactic in building social movements that are um, that are strong, and community-based self-care where people learn how to take each other into account, learn how to give each other space to heal, learn actually how to just act as if we were comrades with one another. And in trauma-based therapy, individualistic therapy, taking agency, seeing yourself as someone who can solve your own problems is part of the healing process. And I think that can be applied to communities, where in communities uh, realize that together, it's their neighbors are not their enemies. Neighbors aren't their adversaries, but their neighbors can actually be their collaborators to overcome racism and class oppression and sexist malarkey that pockmarks our cities. But that's also translates to being part of the healing process. But it all really does start in making sure that we have an ethic of doing no harm to one another in the name of politics.
And so a lot of this work and a lot of this organizing work and action around displacement takes place in the Mission District. Can you tell us a little bit about the Mission District and its sort of situation within San Francisco?
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll rewind a few decades. So the Mission District is in many ways San Francisco's first neighborhood. It was named after the Mission Dolores, which is where the Spaniards set up both their kind of ideological and spiritual camp, and also their military camp to conquer what would then become to known as San Francisco and subjugate First Nation people. So over many decades, it's kind of been the laboratory for both oppression and resistance in a developing city. It used to be a very, it's always been an immigrant community. At one point, it was Italian and Irish, and after World War II, it became increasingly Latino. Has a long history of resistance. There was the case of the Los Siete de la Raza in the late 60s and early 70s, where 7 Latino youth were accused of shooting police officers, and the response of their defense committee really set the tone. Put a very Latino tone on, a very radical nationalistic tone on much of the organizing that still goes on in the Mission District. It was the only community in San Francisco that was where there was a proposed redevelopment plan that was actually defeated by the Mission Coalition organization in the 70s that did very, very broad coalition-based organizing. My friend Mike Miller writes a lot about this in a book called An Organizer's Tale, and it's well worth studying, for both their successes and their failures. But in the 90s, it was kind of ground zero for what we know as the first tech wave, as what we industries and businesses known as the .coms were coming in, buying up uh, you know, buying up all the available office space. Newly affluent young tech workers were flooding in, and rents were skyrocketing. Not that much different than what's going on in what we call .com part two, but very particular in some ways. Uh, in the late, all throughout the 90s, as I write, there were many, many organizations that took on displacement in housing and did a fantastic job. St. Peter's Housing Committee, Mission Housing Development Corporation, San Francisco Tenants Union, Mission Agenda, as we mentioned, and many others. But the Mission Anti-Displacement Coalition was the first time that many of these organizations started to, fight together and walk together in coalition. I was a part of it, and it was a very creative time. It was a very energizing time, and we were able to put thousands of people out into the streets to, protest evictions. We had a gigantic direct action arm. We did, were able to, kind of expose the hidden hand of, city planning in displacement by taking on the Planning Commission and the Planning Department. It was, largely led by Latinos, a group called Poder, people organizing, defending employment rights, and, Mission Housing Development Corporation, a guy named Eric Casada, who, is no longer with us, really made sure that the needs of low-income immigrants were very front and center in this fight. And what Mac did was actually change the entire conversation around displacement in the 90s. So instead of the story being told solely through, wow, there's a boom economy and there's these unfortunate consequences of it, but isn't it great that San Francisco's economy is on the upswing? The consequences of displacement were actually, moved front and center in all areas, and really changed many people's hearts and minds in the way that they perceived their own agency, and who was to blame for the crisis, which was largely the inability of local government to actually even attempt to intervene in this. It was very laissez-faire, or neoliberal economics at work and neoliberal urban policies at work. So, as a part of changing this conversation, many people in San Francisco were part of what became known as the progressive sweep of 1990-2000, when almost all of the very conservative members of the Board of Supervisors were exited in kind of an electoral populist sweep. And in their place came, some fairly honest progressive people like Chris Daly, like Matt Gonzalez, that became city supervisors, and they were formerly activists or organizers in the in the community. Not all of which were MAC members, of course, but most people who came into power at that time, were genuinely connected to some sort of neighborhood organizing or social movement, to various degrees. So our main mistake, really, we actually made, we made two main mistakes, and one is that we got a little bit too comfy with the legislative system. So we were at this point where we could actually trailblaze brand new urban politics, and keep up the direct action and the mass mobilization and increase it, and still deal honestly with the fact that there were some people in City Hall that actually wanted to do good things and pass good protections. But we got a little bit too insidery, because we were used to in order, kind of the old way that you got an appointment with a supervisor was to go in and tie yourself to to their furniture in their office, right? Do a sit-in because they didn't want to talk to us, and all of a sudden it was, folks that most of us had experience drinking beer with, were all of a sudden city supervisors, and it was a big shift, and we didn't grapple with that, and we we for the large, for the most part, demobilized the outside game and got our inside game on, and we should have done both. And the other mistake is that we didn't really put forward a vision of what community ownership looked like as a solution to displacement. Community ownership models like community land trusts and efforts to decommodify housing, to establish the human right of housing. Um, I We're largely left out of the dialogue, even though many individuals, probably the majority of people in Mission Anti-Displacement Coalition certainly believed in the right to housing as a human right, not as a privilege and not as a commodity. But we never put forward really ambitious goals like that around, hey, could we stabilize this community by taking 1,000 units out of the speculative market and putting it into community ownership models, things like that. Those conversations that were never fully allowed to bloom. So the reforms that were put forward, such as changing zoning, very honorable, preserving rent control, very honorable, and building more affordable housing, very honorable goals. All of them, uh, you know, weren't a big enough weapon to ultimately to to ultimately intervene in the housing crisis.
I want to talk more about the right to housing and your vision of how to build really direct and local control and power in communities to push back against neoliberalism and against austerity and for the right to housing for everyone. But first I want to talk about what you see that you did right, that the coalition did right throughout its work. So some things that you mentioned were tactical alliances with artists in the area. You also um, talk about the interplay between direct action and more traditional tactics like uh, press conferences and meeting with elected officials, that sort of thing. So, can you talk a little bit about what you think the coalition did right and what tactics you think really worked?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the strengths of the Mission Anti-Displacement Coalition is that, at the same time that it centered the needs of working class Latinos in, in the neighborhood, it was never narrowly nationalistic by any stretch of the imagination. There were alliances with displaced artist spaces that were going on, actual conversations on how to fight together to make more for all. And I think that while that again that conversation was never fully bloomed, I think that's ultimately what really scared the power structure in many ways, because people who were expected to be at each other's throats and to make accusations against one another, to play play games against each other. There was an attempt to make an alliance between between different sectors, different levels of people, different advantages within the 99%, or what we call the 99% today. And I think that was very profound. And the fact that it was based is, almost all the organizations that were part of MAC, had an ethic of door knocking, of a ethic of face-to-face outreach. So when people would get up and say, "We want something," it was, there was actual very intense outreach process behind it, which I think can be very lacking in many ways that community groups formulate issues. So that and the fact with being able to put so many people out into the streets and and mobilize that we're able to pass through many interim controls that slowed down gentrification, quite a bit in the mission. Certainly didn't eliminate it, certainly didn't solve the problem, but solve but uh, slowed things down. So when the market eventually burst, in the early 2000s, many more people had their housing that it had Mac done nothing.
You write that both the irony of displacement is that both disinvestment and investment can hurt residents. Can you talk about um, how both of those things can lead to further displacement?
Yeah, so when a neighborhood is disinvested, which it's actually the first phase of gentrification and displacement. I think that there are some voices, not everyone, of course, some voices on the left that kind of romanticize disinvestment, romanticize slum-like conditions in neighborhoods because they believe that if things are so bad, the yuppies are never going to want to never going to want to live there. Crime is a form of rent control, and this is just clearly mistaken, although probably well intentioned. What happens when a neighborhood is disinvested in when it's when it has slum-like conditions, that's when developers just buy up property and warehouse it. They may rent it out to somebody for a while, or they may keep it vacant, but they're just waiting and they're biding their. Then, of course, this is also the best time to push forward different forms of community ownership because the land is a lot cheaper, the buildings are a lot cheaper, and it's the best time to kind of bolster a neighborhood against eventual displacement. And so, I draw a lot from the theories and the thoughts of the deceased Neil Smith, who wrote the gentrification in the revanchist city, rather the New Frontier gentrification in the revanchist city, and he really clearly points out that disinvestment is actually the first phase of gentrification and displacement in that book. But so is hyper investment, of course. So the solutions really begin with long-term grassroots economic planning, not just in the sphere of housing, because when most urban politics are a bit like a hostage situation. Like, hey, we'll give you your housing, but if you take your housing, you can't have jobs. If you want the jobs, you're going to have to sign off on your housing eventually becoming unaffordable in your community. And so people look at that and make a calculation, and oftentimes people who are likely to be displaced by uneven development in the neighborhood will support that development because of the promise of jobs. Because obviously people need income, and people need to eat and survive, and would take a risk on eventual displacement if it means eating today. It doesn't come from being a sold out member of the labor bourgeoisie. It comes from having to feed your kids. So I point out the examples like in Cleveland, Ohio, that where the city has actually actively encouraged, real worker co-ops like the Evergreen Cooperative as a form of economic development. When people have living wage jobs, they can look with clear eyes on development in the city, and they can say, is this proposed development beneficial to us or not? They're no longer hostages. They have the economic freedom to be able to collectively decide what's good and what's bad in their neighborhood, and embrace the changes that are good and reject the changes and organize against the changes that would displace or that would harm their community. And it really does go back to go back to those basic equations.
So tell us about the effort to have community ownership in San Francisco, specifically the San Francisco Community Land Trust.
Yeah, so the San Francisco Community Land Trust, people started organizing for it, around some beers after a Mission Anti-Displacement Coalition meeting in about 1999. It was formally incorporated 10 years ago in 2004. And its goal is to take housing out of the speculative market and put it into the hands of the people. Community Land Trust is a ownership model or a tactic where um, housing is run cooperatively. It's deed restricted, so it can never be sold for an exorbitant profit. In fact, it actually stays affordable in perpetuity forever. And the affordability is actually protected in the same way that a forest trust would protect old growth redwood forests, or a very similar way, actually. So in San Francisco, that got jump started by a group of mostly Chinese immigrants that were fighting back against their evictions in Chinatown, right at the border of Chinatown, uh, the North Beach district, and the financial district. Some very, very, very desirable high end property, and both a public institution, City College, and private developer wanted them off. And they fought back with the help of Chinatown Community Development Center and Asian Law Caucus, for many years. And ultimately, through some, really determined organizing and refusals to move, the building was sold to the San Francisco Community Land Trust and was renovated with, with the direct involvement of the residents, and is now a permanently affordable cooperative where the residents no longer have to worry about ever being evicted because of somebody else's drive for profits. And currently there are only 65 units of land trust housing in San Francisco. So just to put that in perspective, is that even though it's a great alternative, it's previews a much better way of doing housing in the future. It's still very, very hard to build and to actually use as an intervention in the housing crisis. But it's been very effective at creating a dialogue about what might be possible in the future.
So, what do the average rents look like, or how do you pay for the community land trust and pay to maintain the buildings and maintain good living conditions for residents?
Well, first of all, it's not free housing, of course. Residents have to pay, just like anywhere else. But, in the example I just mentioned, 53 Columbus, the a new unit, if someone were to move in there, for a one bedroom would be about $700. In almost any other part of town, that same unit would be about $2,100 or more. So it's about a third of the price of the market. So as with anything, any form of affordable housing, it's about raising enough money to close the rent gap, which is basically the gap between what residents can afford to pay and what the mortgage is going to be. So our in the San Francisco Community Land Trust, the purchase price, of course, has been driven down through political action, right? Where the owner was willing to sell at a reduced price, which brought things down quite a bit. We also, we've also explored many different tactics, such as, reasonable investments from union pension funds, and partnerships with community development financing institutions, and smaller financial entities, not the ones that are doing the foreclosures in the world, but the smaller, more community oriented ones. But it's also part about demanding public investment to do this type of work, directly from the city. I like to see it as a form of reparations for their years of inaction in intervening with the speculative market to begin with.
You really emphasize the need to hook in community land trust into the community, not just institute democratic structures within the building, but also really root those within a community. And you briefly tell the story of cooperative housing efforts from the 1920s and 30s in New York City that were put forward by Communist Party members that had standalone democratic governance structures within the building, and within a few decades removed the affordability restrictions that protected future residents coming in. So why is it, or how do you put these ideals of community and resident democratic governance in practice?
Well, it's a balance. You can't have so much democracy and so much self-determination that people decide to take the building to market and to evaporate all of the good work that has been done to save the housing. Or in the case of New York, where maybe grandma and grandpa were a big radical anti-capitalist that believed in taking housing off the speculative market, but their grandchildren were stockbrokers and didn't want anything to do with that model and sold things off and moved to break the affordability restrictions there. And that's what you can do. That's what can happen when you have one person, one vote in a standalone cooperative, because ideas ideas change around around housing, and usually change usually the pressures of the marketplace and the kind of ideological push that housing has to be a commodity rear their head again, even if you have a victory. So you have to have a check and balance that says that the public investment, the human investment of all the volunteer time that goes into establishing a community land trust isn't wasted, and that as much as we support grassroots community democracy and participatory democracy, there's limits to that as well, and that housing has to be has to be permanently affordable, not for the people who have it, but also for the people who need it in the future.
So, you write that across the country there are community land trusts springing up in cities everywhere. Can you tell us about this push towards the community land trust model and what is working either in San Francisco or in these other places, and what doesn't work?
Yeah, my back of the envelope calculations that community land trust and limited equity models as a whole probably account for about 1% of the nation's housing stock altogether, which certainly isn't enough to intervene in the national housing crisis. But certain communities are doing really innovative work. Certainly, the entire state of Vermont. This is one of the gigantic, one of the main affordable housing strategies that Vermont has pursued. But also in North Carolina, it's been used as a form of positive economic development in predominantly African American communities outside of Durham. In Albuquerque, there's the Sawmill Community Land Trust that was particularly innovative because they started building a land trust long before the displacement engine happened, because they could see what was coming down the pike, and they could see the opportunity to build the type of community counter institution that could intervene. And they continue to this day. In Seattle has two land trusts. One that was actually has its genesis in organized squatting movements, and New York was certainly under the leadership of organizations like Picture the Homeless, really starting to develop a great community land trust response. Chicago is quite interested in this, and in Portland, I visited a great organization called Proud Ground, which is just really taking off. And even though the displacement pressures in Portland and other parts of Oregon are quite intense, they really kind of have a head start in providing safety and affordable resident controlled housing there. So it's a quiet movement that I think could really bloom as people will inevitably search for solutions to the housing crisis.
One of the themes of your book and one of the calls that you make is that nonprofits and especially community land trusts be invested in long-term solutions and solidarity, and not necessarily in short-term gains, and to really be reliant on the community and networked into the community, and not in an exclusive way, but in an inclusive way. So can you tell us a little bit more about why you feel so strongly about that, and where you've seen nonprofits succeed or fail at that?
Absolutely, and it's never there's a lot of gray area in this conversation that we should preface this. So certainly, those of us that have been around activist circles for a while are used to the dialogue around the nonprofit industrial complex, and there's certainly some truth to the critique. But let's remember that the movement that birthed nonprofit housing developers has very, very radical roots around the calls for self-determination and neighborhood control that traces itself back to the Black Panthers, the Young Lords, many of the urban uprisings of the 1960s and 70s as people were you know searching for ways to directly impact impact and address white supremacy and poverty in their communities. So the all of these organizations that we can critique right now actually have radical roots. And when you start to try to manage housing and manage housing that is safe, decent, and affordable, a place where anybody would want to live, you certainly come up with many just hurdles, right? Because it's hard enough to run a business like that for profit, but when you try to run a business like that uh, in a nonprofit way, in a way that prioritizes human needs over the rental payments, there's all these structural problems that conservatize that organization. But that said, going back to the roots, going back to the you know to the power that brought these organizations into being in the first place is very essential because it's without social movements, without large human rights movements, non nonprofits find themselves with fewer options to do really well in the community, and they start to fetishize small gains instead of some of the bigger ones. It doesn't mean that every nonprofit has to be the first person, the first organization rather out there at the picket line or an occupation or whatnot, but they have to figure out ways to support these movements and not cut deals to curtail their success. Nonprofit housing developers, no matter what you think about them, are one of the few places in gentrified cities where working class people actually exist in mass, where they're not being pushed out and dispersed over a large geographic area, where there's actually working class communities left, especially in places like San Francisco or Seattle or increasingly other cities. So ignoring them and taking a blanket of anti-nonprofit line, isn't isn't wise either. They should be seen as somewhat like trade unions, like I write about in the book, that they're large institutions, and you want to make sure that those institutional uh, powers and resources actually go towards complementing a movement instead of sabotaging one.
A through line of your book is the city as a site of conflict. And so you write that in San Francisco, uh, for new residents, moving into some of these neighborhoods was portrayed as, them being pioneers or even like colonizers coming in, compared to existing residents and their struggle for the right to the city and the right to housing. So, can you talk about why you think it's so important to center the right to housing and the right to the city as a part of our analysis and organizing work?
Well, housing isn't the only economic engine in this nation, but it's large. It's real estate is one of the largest, and it's increasingly one of the ways that capital finds itself in neighborhoods is through housing. And when we let capital flow through neighborhoods without any form of regulation, without any form of accountability, we see displacement, and we see that people's need for housing as a human right becomes secondary, and it plays into kind of the neoliberal dialogue that comes up with an excuse for victimization and an excuse for abuse. If someone loses her housing, it must be because of something that she did or something that she did not achieve, right? Oh, you're an immigrant. Oh, you have too many kids. Oh, you don't have, you didn't get yourself through community college and build a career. And when you center the human right for housing, it basically starts to scuttle those arguments. It says if you're a human being, you you deserve the right to a home that's respectable. You have the right to a community that's developed for and by the community. And I'm very, very careful not to get in as much into the newcomer versus old timer thing. Because certainly existing communities, working class ones, especially those of color, need to be central in this fight. But cities of course change, and new people come, and new people aren't necessarily rich. New people can be immigrants from El Salvador or Mexico, fleeing the impacts of globalization. Newcomers can be our queer brothers and sisters who are looking to exist and develop their lives in less homophobic settings, and those are all positive changes. So I don't want, when I say community preservation, I don't want that to lead into xenophobia by any stretch of the imagination, but I want changes that come to cities to not be at the expense of long-term communities, especially working class ones. There's that's we want to embrace change, but we don't want change to actually break the back of existing communities. And part of that is just the right to the city, that people who have who contribute to a city through their labor, through their activities, through their contributions to community, actually have the right to help determine the path of that city, to have the right to that city to be developed in their interest. And the way to do that is to, in a smart way, is to demand more for all. And I don't mean that in a way where we bulldoze over very real realities around race and class differences, but where we center those fights, where we of course, but we also build the demand for more for all, so teachers can stay in their communities, so first responders, your medics can actually live in the community that they rescue people in every day. We want housing for everybody who across the range of need, whether you're currently worried about being pushed out of the city that your family has been a part of, or whether you're coming out of living in a homeless shelter, or any point in between. We want to radicalize and radicalize the masses, not just one group, and and push forward around housing for all.
Is there anything else that you want listeners to know, or any projects you want to direct them towards?
Well, definitely, start where you're at. Check out check out the Right to the City website. They have a pretty good directory of organizations all across the country that are working on these issues. And so start with a barbecue. Start by getting to know your neighbors. Whether you've been there for your family's been there for 4 decades, or you've been there for 40 minutes. Get to know your neighbors. Find out what the conditions are. And I hope that your listeners will come and find me on book tour, and having fantastic conversations with people all across the West Coast, and starting November 17th in Washington D.C. and moving up to Boston. I'll be on the East Coast, hopefully beating whatever blizzards the coast has in store. So hope to meet people for face-to-face conversations this next month.
And folks can find those tour dates at AK Press?
Yes, revolutionbythebook.org blog.
Great. Okay, well, thank you